4 years into Russia's full-scale invasion, the geopolitical map of Ukraine looks entirely different than anyone predicted. It is mid-2026, and on paper, the nation is experiencing a military peak. The numbers from the front lines are staggering. Ukraine's forces are currently inflicting an average of 32,000 Russian casualties every single month. Meanwhile, the once booming Russian war economy has essentially flatlined, with growth hitting just 0.2% this year. Yet, right in the middle of these gains, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy shook the establishment. He fired his top military brass, including Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky, replacing the very men who orchestrated these record-breaking battlefield numbers. The reason for this shakeup becomes clear when you look away from the battlefield and toward the civilian homefront. This UN document outlines the UNHCR's urgent 2026 funding appeal. To keep the civilian population from collapsing, the agency requires $614 million, with $470 million dedicated strictly to humanitarian needs inside Ukraine. While Ukraine is dismantling the Russian military on the ground, its people are enduring the darkest humanitarian crisis in modern history. To understand this phase of the war, we have to look at how these two opposing realities feed into each other. The recent battlefield victories stem from a deliberate tactical pivot. Recognizing they couldn't win a traditional war of attrition against a much larger enemy, Ukraine moved away from relying on a million-man army and created the world's first dedicated unmanned systems force. First-person view, or FPV drones, are now the primary weapon of this conflict. These highly maneuverable aircraft account for 95% of Russian military casualties. But the true strategic damage is happening far behind the front lines. Mid- and long-range drones are systematically dismantling Russian logistics, targeting critical oil supplies and major refineries deep inside Russian territory. If we zoom in on the Kerch Strait, the impact is severe. Drone strikes have destroyed 3/4 of Russia's ferry capacity here, forcing Moscow to pull naval units away from the front lines just to protect what little shipping remains. This brings us back to the military shakeup. The new commander-in-chief, Mikhailo Drapati, was brought in specifically to accelerate this exact strategy. His mandate is to intensify these deep counteroffensive operations and push even further behind enemy lines. By utilizing an asymmetrical technological chokehold, Ukraine is successfully neutralizing Russia's overwhelming manpower advantage. They are starving the Russian military machine of the fuel and supplies it needs to function. But Moscow has adapted. Unable to counter the drone swarms or gain ground conventionally, the Russian military has pivoted to a different target, the Ukrainian home front. Since June 2026, Russia has altered its aerial tactics. Instead of relying primarily on slower cruise missiles, they are launching relentless barrages of high-velocity ballistic missiles designed to bypass Ukrainian air defenses. These strikes are aimed squarely at the civilian energy grid. The goal is to leave millions of people without reliable heating, running water, or electricity, right as temperatures plunge below zero. The human cost of this infrastructure war is devastating. UN data reveals that 2025 was the deadliest year for civilians since the initial invasion, with war-related casualties rising by 31%. Inside the country, the scale of destruction is overwhelming. Over 10.8 million people currently require humanitarian assistance, and 2.5 million homes have been damaged or completely destroyed. This graphic from the UN Refugee Agency outlines the response needed for those who fled. It highlights the targets for protecting and providing legal assistance to the nearly 6 million refugees outside Ukraine, who are now facing exhausted social protections and prolonged family separation. Russia's current strategy has moved beyond territory. It is a deliberate campaign to exhaust the civilian population through cold and hunger until the political cost of continuing becomes unsustainable. This leaves us with the stark reality of the conflict in 2026. It is an asymmetrical race between Ukrainian drones starving Russian supply lines and Russian missiles freezing Ukrainian civilians. This is exactly why the new military command under Drapati is accelerating those deep drone strikes. They are in a desperate sprint to cripple the Russian war machine before the Ukrainian civilian population reaches a total breaking point. Tactical military victories are essential for keeping Ukraine on the map. But a destroyed Russian oil refinery cannot heat a freezing apartment in Kyiv, and an intercepted supply ship cannot feed a displaced family. That is why the $614 million UN appeal is a strategic requirement for survival. These fragile, temporary lifelines, like charging stations and warming tents, are what physically keep the nation running while the army fights. Looking past the battlefield innovations reveals the true state of Ukraine today. Weapons and strategy supply only half the victory. The quiet, desperate battle to keep the civilian population alive will ultimately determine the survival of the nation.